Lena Harding had never been one for gatherings. She wasn't antisocial, not in the clinical sense, just practical. People brought unpredictability, and she'd lived long enough to understand that comfort came from order, not noise. But for once, just this once, she had made an exception. After nearly 9 months of renovation, paperwork, misdelivered lumber, and storm damage that set everything back by 2 weeks, her property was finally in the shape she had envisioned since buying it. Her backyard, once a patchy mess of uneven dirt and broken paving stones, was now her personal project completed. A sleek concrete patio lined with embedded lighting, a fire-safe cooking space with a covered pergola, a modern industrial charcoal grill she'd picked up secondhand from a local restaurant supplier, and a neat line of trees she'd planted herself along the edges for privacy. It wasn't showy. Lena didn't do showy. But it was clean. It was hers. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could exhale without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on her. The place was supposed to be a haven from the long, grease-stained days at her auto repair shop, from invoices, from suppliers with excuses, and clients with unreasonable deadlines. She had worked her way up from being the only woman in a rusted garage full of men who never handed her the right wrench, to owning the damn building, employing 6 people, and being the one who now signed the checks. It was a hard-earned peace. She had invited a handful of friends, not clients, not neighbors, not loose acquaintances, just people she trusted to not break anything, to show up on time, and to leave when they said they would. No flyers, no open invites, no party streamers. Just good grilled food, decent beer, and the pleasure of silence occasionally interrupted by dry humor and music that wasn't louder than conversation. She prepped for the evening herself, chopped onions and peppers, marinated brisket overnight, triple-checked the propane tanks for the side heater even though she didn't plan on using them unless the wind turned. By 5:30 p.m., chairs were arranged in a wide semicircle facing the grill. Music played softly from a tucked-away Bluetooth speaker, and her guests began to arrive, all of them understanding the unspoken rule: keep it low-key. For the first hour, everything was exactly as she wanted. People laughed, drank slowly, praised the setup without being obnoxious about it. Lena rotated burgers with practiced ease, nodding along to a story about someone's nightmare camping trip. When she first heard the noise car doors slamming, too many of them in quick succession, she didn't think much of it until she noticed unfamiliar voices growing louder near the side gate. She frowned, lifting her head and glancing past the wooden fencing. Then came the unmistakable scrape of the latch opening. She hadn't invited anyone else. That gate had been locked from the inside. 3 folding tables appeared first, carried by 2 men she didn't recognize. They didn't look at her, didn't pause, just started unfolding them along the edge of her patio, as if they were setting up for a school fundraiser. Then came the balloons. Metallic, shiny, loud. She didn't know where they had come from or how fast they inflated them, but they were tied around her pergola supports before she could even get a word out. Finally, walking with her signature quick, heel-to-toe stride, appeared Karen Mitchell, the woman who lived 2 houses down, who once told Lena that her truck disrupted the visual harmony of the street, who once threatened to report her to the local board for automotive smells, and who had never once said hello without adding a complaint afterward. Karen carried a clear drink in one hand and waved with the other like she was walking onto a stage. "Hey, I'm so glad you went ahead and got started," she called brightly, her voice coated in sugar. "I told everyone to come by around 6, but I guess we're early." Lena's first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion so sharp it rendered her silent. Her grip on the grill tongs tightened. Her guests looked around uneasily as more unfamiliar faces filtered into the yard, carrying paper bags, plastic containers, wine bottles. Someone had even dragged in a cooler full of sodas and dropped it next to the chairs Lena had arranged. She blinked twice, trying to process what was happening. Karen was now standing across from her, blocking access to the grill. "I figured you wouldn't mind combining," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We always do a block party the first week of May. Didn't you get the email? No, Lena said flatly. Karen clicked her tongue. Oh, I must have sent it to the previous owner's contact. You know, they used to host it here all the time. I just assumed you were keeping the tradition going. I never agreed to that, Lena said, more firmly this time, her voice cutting through the rising hum of chatter. Karen chuckled. Well, it's a community, sweetheart. It's not about agreeing. It's about being open. She turned away before Lena could answer and began directing more arrivals like a seasoned maitre d'. In the next 20 minutes, Lena's grill was taken over by a man in a branded apron who said he was Karen's cousin, the cook. Her carefully prepared side dishes were shoved to the edge of the table to make room for plastic-wrapped trays of frozen sliders. Her music was drowned out by a Bluetooth speaker someone had synced to a playlist of bass-heavy pop. Someone dragged a beanbag chair from her garage without asking. A kid rode a scooter across the lawn, knocking over one of her new saplings. Lena's guests thinned out. A few exchanged glances with her, one of them whispering, "Do you want us to say something?" She shook her head. She wasn't about to escalate, not with kids running around and 20-plus strangers camped out on her lawn like it was their right. But the rage built slowly, like smoke in the walls. She walked inside, stood in the kitchen with her hands on the counter, and stared out the window. Her backyard was no longer hers. It had been hijacked with such speed and confidence that it almost felt like she was the one trespassing now. Her name wasn't even on the cake that someone had placed on the central table, just Karen's annual BBQ bash. The implication was clear: Lena wasn't hosting. She was being tolerated on her own land. That night, after the final straggler had left, and Karen had simply waved a lazy goodbye, instead of apologizing or offering to help clean, Lena stepped out into the darkened yard and took inventory of the wreckage. Half-burnt coals still smoldered in the grill, now covered in sticky residue and crusted meat. There were greasy napkins stuck between the patio bricks, spilled drinks soaking into the mulch around her plants, and someone had dragged a folding chair across the concrete, scratching it. She stood there for a long time, her breath even, her face unreadable. Then she did something simple. She went back inside, pulled out a legal pad from the drawer by the fridge, and wrote one word at the top of the page. Boundaries. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew there wouldn't be a next time. Lena didn't act immediately. That wasn't her way. She wasn't impulsive, and she didn't do petty. Her entire career had been built on the principle of timing, whether it was aligning pistons to a fraction of a millimeter or knowing exactly when to walk out of a bad client negotiation without saying a word. Let the problem show its face fully before you go in. So instead of confronting Karen the morning after the hijacked BBQ, Lena did what she did best. She watched, she listened, and she prepared. The day after the chaos, Lena spent the morning in silence, walking her yard with a clipboard and a camera, documenting everything that had been touched, moved, broken, or left behind. Her grill had a new dent where someone had dropped a cooler against it. One of the wooden supports on her pergola had a long scrape from a speaker being hoisted into place. A small ornamental tree had been knocked over completely, and several decorative tiles were cracked from where a guest had dragged metal legs across the surface. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was damage, disrespect, an erasure of her effort. No one had asked to be there. No one had apologized for being there. And as she sat down that afternoon with a strong cup of black coffee and an equally strong resolve, Lena realized the problem wasn't just Karen's arrogance, it was that everyone else had gone along with it, like it was normal. Her phone buzzed just before noon. A text from one of her clients, who lived a block over. Heard the BBQ went well. Karen said you're on board for Memorial Day too. Lena stared at the screen. Her hands didn't tremble, but her jaw clenched. She typed back slowly. Karen didn't have permission for anything. It won't happen again. She didn't get a reply. That was the moment the tone shifted from frustration to vigilance. By early evening, Lena began to receive more messages, each with a slightly different tone. Some were polite, others passive-aggressive. One neighbor said she'd heard conflicting things about whether Lena was part of the neighborhood events. Another asked if Lena could send the recipe for the ribs, assuming they were part of the shared catering. Lena didn't respond to most of them. Instead, she printed each one out and added it to a growing folder labeled Documentation, Unauthorized Event. 2 days later, while taking out the trash, Lena noticed something odd tucked under her recycling bin. A manila envelope. No postage, no markings, just her name handwritten in looping cursive. She opened it slowly, and inside was a photocopy of a letter, clearly aged on yellowing paper. It was addressed from the previous owner of her home, Walter Jensen, and it looked like a personal note. It read, "To whom it may concern, I have always supported our little tradition of hosting annual community BBQs in the backyard of this property. It brings people together. I hope future residents continue to honor that spirit." It wasn't dated. It wasn't notarized. It wasn't even original. It was a copy, possibly scanned and reprinted. And in the corner, in blue pen, someone had written, "Community always comes first." Lena didn't need to be told where it came from. She looked up and saw Karen across the street, pretending to water her front lawn with exaggerated casualness, like someone in a sitcom who thinks they're being subtle. Their eyes met. Karen smiled. Lena didn't. That evening, Lena called an attorney not for a lawsuit, not yet, but for clarity. The woman she spoke to specialized in residential property disputes. Lena explained the situation plainly, without embellishment or emotion, just facts. There had been an unauthorized use of private property, repeated boundary violations, and now a vague implication that her backyard was part of some communal understanding. The attorney asked for a copy of Lena's deed, which Lena already had in both paper and digital form. Within 24 hours, the attorney confirmed what Lena already suspected. There were no shared easements, no neighborhood rights of way, no recorded communal usage agreements. Lena's land was hers, fully. Legally, no gray area. She had the right to remove, exclude, and deny entry to anyone without explicit permission. The letter from Walter Jensen, the attorney said, held no legal weight. It was sentiment, not substance. Lena thanked her, made notes, and printed the deed with the attorney's digital signature confirming the review. Then she did something subtle but final. She bought a new lock for the side gate. She didn't slam it. She didn't post warnings. She simply installed the new hardware and turned the bolt with a smooth, satisfied click. She wanted the sound to settle in the wood. She wanted it to mean something. But Karen wasn't done. The following Saturday, Lena returned home from a supply run and noticed that someone had unlatched the back fence. Not broken it, just lifted the latch, swung the gate open slightly, and walked away. It was barely noticeable, but Lena noticed. She always did. She closed it, relocked it, and moved on. The next day, she found a plastic bag tied to her mailbox, filled with paper plates, a bottle of barbecue sauce, and a note, "Since you're already hosting, thought I'd contribute." Lena placed the bag on the sidewalk and left it there until the wind carried it away. But what finally snapped wasn't another party. It was silence. One Monday morning, she opened her garage and found someone had stacked folding chairs against the outer wall. 4 of them, identical to the ones used during Karen's event. They weren't hers. She hadn't seen who placed them there. No cameras had caught it. No note was attached. But they were there, leaned against her property like it was a storage unit. And that, more than the noise, the intrusion, the careless trampling of her plants, that quiet entitlement, was the final trigger. Lena didn't rage. She didn't shout at the sky. Instead, she stood for a full minute, taking it in, memorizing it. Then she walked back inside, picked up her phone, and called a friend who worked in heavy towing. She didn't explain the whole situation. She just asked if they had availability for a private removal. "What are we pulling?" he asked. She looked out the window at the grill, still streaked with the remains of Karen's party. "Industrial unit. Needs to be out of the yard fast," she said. "Can you handle that?" The pause on the other end was short. "We've hauled heavier." "What's the surface?" "Concrete, no slope." "Then yeah, we can do it. Just give me the word." Lena gave him a day and a time. It wasn't retaliation. It was restoration. She went to bed that night with her phone off, her windows locked, and her resolve sharpened. The next time Karen stepped onto her property, there wouldn't be a polite reminder or a quiet gesture. There would be action. Legal. Final. Loud if necessary, and she wouldn't need to raise her voice to make it heard. Lena didn't expect peace after the first standoff, but she had underestimated just how quickly people doubled down when their entitlement was challenged. The night before the scheduled removal, she sat alone on her porch with the grill cold and untouched. The industrial unit that once symbolized independence now felt like a Trojan horse, something that had invited invaders under the guise of community. She thought back to how precise she'd been about the placement, how she'd triple-checked clearance for wind patterns, and even installed a custom cover to protect it from the elements. All of it had been respected by her, until others trampled that respect with folding tables and supermarket sausages. But she had made a decision, and tomorrow, that symbol would be gone, removed by force, if necessary. She wouldn't wait for another ambush disguised as neighborliness. The morning of the tow began quietly. Overcast sky, slight humidity, the kind that made concrete feel sticky, and tires squeal just a little louder on the pavement. Lena's towing contact, a thick-armed man named Ron, arrived at 11:04 a.m. right on time. He didn't ask questions, just parked the flap carefully by the driveway and nodded. "You sure you want it on the truck, not just relocated?" he asked once, as a courtesy. "Yeah," Lena said. "I'm done with it. Put it on the flatbed and strap it good." Ron didn't smile or nod again. He just got to work. As the grill was being winched into place, the steel wheels screeching slightly over the concrete, a silver SUV pulled up across the street and idled for a moment too long. Lena didn't turn around. She already knew the vehicle, the tinted windows, the condescending precision with which it always parked. She didn't flinch when Karen got out, heels clacking against the curb like gunfire. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen's voice was high and incredulous, as if someone had canceled her cable subscription without notice. Lena turned her head just slightly, not moving from her place near the edge of the patio. "I'm moving my grill," she said simply. Karen laughed, short and disbelieving. "You mean our grill? That's the neighborhood unit. It's been used for years here. You don't just get to tow it like it's some abandoned car." Lena raised an eyebrow. "It's mine. I bought it. I paid for it. I installed it. You hijacked it." Karen took a step closer. "Look, I get that you're new here relatively, but there's a history on this street. People share. We make room. That grill was part of something bigger than just your ego project." Lena glanced at Ron, who gave a half shrug and tightened the last of the straps with a final metallic crank. "Well," Lena said, her voice even, "now it's part of a scrapyard invoice." Karen's mouth tightened. "You can't seriously expect people to take this well. You embarrassed me. You're alienating yourself." "Good," Lena said, turning away. "Then they'll stay off my lawn." Karen opened her mouth again, but the roar of the truck engine cut her off. The flat reversed slowly out of the driveway, grill in tow, and Lena watched it leave with a finality that felt less like loss and more like subtraction, removing something that had served its purpose and overstayed its welcome. The next 48 hours unfolded like a campaign, not direct confrontation, but low-level harassment disguised as neighborly concern. Someone left a flyer in her mailbox for an open-pit barbecue workshop with a highlighted message, "Real grilling brings people together." A delivery driver arrived with 10 large pizzas Lena hadn't ordered. When she told him it was a mistake, he looked at the receipt and read the name, Karen M. She refused the delivery. The next day, her garbage can was turned sideways in the middle of her driveway, smeared with what looked like barbecue sauce. Lena didn't react. She just kept documenting. Every incident was logged with date, time, and photo. She updated her file, which now included screen captures of neighborhood message boards where anonymous accounts questioned why she had become hostile toward traditions. One post accused her of destroying community assets. Another claimed she threatened a family gathering. It was surreal. Nothing was signed, but the tone, the fingerprints of passive aggression, they all led to one source. By the end of the week, she received a formal letter folded in a manila envelope, delivered with surprising care to her doorstep. The letterhead was faux official, designed to look like some kind of neighborhood oversight council, but she recognized the formatting. It was pulled from a free legal template website. The language was vague. "We are disappointed by recent actions which have disrupted long-standing norms and cooperative usage agreements." There was no signature. Just a postscript, "Still time to make it right. Think bigger than yourself." Lena placed the letter in a plastic sleeve and slid it into her documentation binder. She wasn't angry. She was observant. And the more Karen escalated, the more obvious her desperation became. It wasn't about Lena. It was about control. Karen had used this neighborhood as her stage for years, inserting herself into every event, every exchange, presenting herself as a natural authority when no one had ever elected her to anything. Lena's refusal to play along had punctured that image, and now Karen was bleeding composure by the gallon. But then Karen overreached. The following Saturday, Lena was working under a '68 Mustang in her garage when she heard movement outside, too organized to be kids, too subtle to be a delivery. She wiped her hands on a rag and stepped outside to find two men in bright orange vests setting up a folding table on her front lawn. A third man, clipboard in hand, was scanning a printed checklist. "What's this?" Lena asked, her voice steady. One of the men turned. "Sign-up booth," he said. "Karen said it's for the spring cleanup roster. Starts here?" "No, it doesn't," Lena replied. "Take it down." The man with the clipboard hesitated. "I mean, we were told this is public-facing. It's just the front edge." Lena stepped forward. "This is my lawn. This isn't a sidewalk. Take it down or I will." They didn't argue again. The table was folded in seconds, and the men backed off with hurried apologies, leaving Karen to arrive 5 minutes later, holding a plastic tub filled with clipboards and registration sheets. "Really?" she said, loud enough for the block to hear. "You couldn't even allow a sign-up sheet?" Lena stared at her for a long second. "You are not entitled to use my property. Ever. If you try it again, you'll deal with actual authorities, not just me." Karen opened her mouth, but something in Lena's eyes must have shifted an edge of steel beneath the calm exterior, because she closed it without speaking. For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just turned and walked away, her shoes making soft, defeated clicks against the pavement. Later that night, Lena installed a discrete motion-triggered spotlight that lit up her entire front yard if someone stepped within 8 feet of the house. She wasn't trying to provoke. She was setting boundaries the only way that seemed to register anymore with consequences. And she didn't care if the light woke up the neighbors. They hadn't seemed to mind when their guests used her fence as a drink holder. At midnight, she watched the motion light flicker on once, then fade. A silhouette had lingered by the sidewalk for just long enough to trigger the sensor. It didn't come back. She sipped her coffee in silence and kept watching. Let them come. Let them try. She wasn't scared. She was ready. Lena had never been fond of the idea that logic alone could win against collective illusion. She'd seen enough in her work insurance disputes over botched vehicle repairs, contractors who swore metal damage was already there, landlords who pretended oil leaks were natural aging to know that the truth didn't always carry weight unless it was heavy with paper, proof, and public silence. And this situation was no different. Karen wasn't operating on truth. She was operating on precedent, nostalgia, and the kind of social manipulation that didn't need facts, just suggestion, enough people who half remembered something and assumed the rest. But Lena had something Karen didn't: clarity and a damn good paper trail. After the front yard incident, Lena stopped waiting for Karen's next move and made one of her own. She set up a meeting with her lawyer, not just over the phone this time, but in person, and brought everything: the photos, the binder, the letter, the printed messages, even the pizza receipt. She explained the history of the grill, the invasion, the false flyer, the unauthorized delivery, and the trespassing disguised as outreach. The lawyer, a woman named Dana Price with tired eyes and a laser-sharp tone, listened quietly and asked only the right questions. When Lena was finished, Dana closed the binder and gave a single nod. You have more than enough, she said. What I want to do is file a formal cease and desist. Not the kind you print off the internet, but something with teeth. We'll send it by courier, signature required. It'll come from my office, with evidence attachments. She won't be able to pretend it was just a misunderstanding. Lena nodded. I don't want escalation. I want it over. That's the point, Dana said. But you should know people like her. When they lose informal control, they often try to shift the playing field. Lena already knew. 2 days after the cease and desist was delivered signed for at 9:13 a.m. by someone at Karen's address, Lena got a knock on her door from a man in a slate gray windbreaker with a lanyard badge. He introduced himself as a representative from the local mediation group, a neighborhood conflict resolution initiative that, according to him, had been notified about an ongoing tension that was affecting communal morale. He didn't say who reported it. He didn't have to. Lena invited him in, not because she had to, but because she wanted the interaction on record. She kept a recording app running in her pocket while he laid out his premise: 2 parties involved in a conflict over space, expectations, and historic usage. His phrasing was careful, diplomatic, and biased by design. He spoke of unspoken community expectations and the need for compromise. He offered to facilitate a conversation with Karen on neutral ground. Lena responded calmly, I'm not negotiating over my property. I'm not interested in community traditions that require trespassing and manipulation. If she wants to host her events, she's welcome to do it on her own lawn. The mediator smiled like a substitute teacher asked to discipline a student twice his size. Would you at least be open to a gesture of shared interest? Sometimes making space for a symbolic agreement diffuses tension. You don't get to symbolically co-own what I pay taxes and insurance for, Lena said. The meeting ended in under 20 minutes. She walked him out, then emailed Dana the entire recording with timestamps. She knew this wouldn't be the last attempt at forced resolution. What she didn't expect, however, came later that week, not from Karen, but from the city. A yellow tag on her front gate. Citation. Complaint filed against her for unapproved structural changes affecting water drainage and footpath symmetry. It was absurd. The only structural modification Lena had made was a gravel trench around the pergola, legal, minor, and pre-approved during the renovation process months earlier. But the phrasing of the citation was vague enough that it triggered a formal inspection request. Lena had 72 hours to respond before fees began accumulating. She knew exactly where it came from. She pulled the file from her cabinet, found the approval letter, the renovation permits, and copies of every photograph taken during the contractor's work. It took her all evening to organize it, highlight dates, and create a response packet with her lawyer's help. Dana submitted it to the city the next morning, but the damage wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the game. Karen had changed tactics. No more parties. No more pizza. Now it was pressure, red tape, nuisance bureaucracy. Lena didn't complain. She simply adapted. She requested a copy of all city complaints associated with her property from the last 6 months. The office clerk, initially hesitant, complied once Lena provided formal justification through her attorney. The results came back: 3 complaints, all anonymous, all within the past 35 days. One about unsecured yard equipment, one about improper signage, and the most recent one about pergola runoff causing drainage issues. Lena laughed when she saw the one about signage. The only sign she had ever posted was a modest aluminum plaque near the gate: private property, no entry without consent. It was regulation. It was legal. But to someone like Karen, it was rebellion. She forwarded the complaints to Dana, who began drafting a pattern harassment claim. It wouldn't be easy to push through, not without direct evidence of authorship, but the frequency and tone were enough to raise eyebrows. Lena's days continued mostly untouched. Her work remained stable. Her home stayed intact. But her routine was not what it had been. She checked her cameras every night. She changed the locks again, upgraded the motion sensor range, added a soft red backlight to the side pathway that glowed when tripped. She wasn't scared. She was simply tired of waiting to be surprised, and somewhere beneath that vigilance, something colder had begun to form. A readiness, not for violence, but for full retribution, if it ever came to that. She still didn't initiate confrontation. She didn't post on neighborhood forums. She didn't send emails. She just watched. And one afternoon she saw Karen's nephew, the same man who had once stood over her grill like it was his birthright, unloading stackable chairs from his truck again. He placed them neatly along Karen's driveway, but a few he wheeled down the sidewalk, stopping just short of Lena's edge. He didn't place them on her lawn this time. He placed them right beside the boundary, close enough to imply, far enough to deny. A new signal. Lena took a picture. She added it to the folder. And then she sat down and began writing something on a clean sheet of paper, not a letter, not a complaint. A statement. Not for the neighbors, not even for the court, but for herself. A line had been crossed, and now she would draw her own. Lena had anticipated escalation, but the manner in which it happened still left her breathless. The morning of the second major confrontation began with her finding the entire length of the side fence vandalized. At first glance it looked like someone had used dark spray paint in an almost artistic pattern, but on closer inspection it revealed itself as nothing more than crude black smears, long arcs intentionally drawn over the wood grain, in an attempt to sabotage not just the appearance of her property, but its sense of order. This wasn't graffiti, it was personal. Someone knew the layout of her yard. Someone had deliberately walked in at dawn to leave a mark. The new motion-activated spotlight flashed again in the corner of her eye as she discovered this evidence, and she made a silent decision. She would not call the police yet. She had to collect the rest of the puzzle first. The backlash that followed was precise and targeted, far more insidious than pizzas or drive-by insults posted on neighborhood boards. Her email inbox filled with complaint after complaint about her motion lights disrupting nocturnal wildlife, her newfangled privacy fence being unsightly and outdated, her security system recording neighbors without consent. The senders were anonymous or using vague first names like Susie or Tom, but each message carried the same tone of faux concern, the same passive-aggressive undertone. Lena responded to none, but quietly printed each one, time-stamping them, and added them to the harassment dossier she and Dana were building. Later that afternoon, she found a printed flyer tucked under her windshield wiper as she pulled out of her driveway to stock up on parts for the repair shop. It read, "You're not a loner, you don't need to act like one. BBQ is what brings us together. Don't hide behind your walls." It wasn't signed Karen, but Lena knew who had commissioned it. She knew the voice behind the message. She placed it in a folder, but before she closed the glove box lid, she took a folded index card with a single phrase written in shaky cursive. Room for everyone, except the silent one. By that evening, the first real physical intrusion happened. She returned home just before dusk and noticed a white van parked across the street, engine running, no lights on. Inside, she could just make out two male silhouettes in the front cabin, the driver and someone beside him. They didn't move. They didn't flash their lights. They just sat, staring at her house, as if waiting for something. She paused in her car, considered honking or flashing her own lights, but stopped. The pavement sloped slightly, and the van's exhaust created a thin trail of fog just ahead of it. It could be coincidence. It might be random. But when she stepped onto the porch, the van pulled away slowly, headlights off, tires whispering over pavement. She slipped inside silently and locked the door behind her. She didn't raise an alarm. She didn't call 911. She placed the van's license plate number in her notes. Next morning, she installed a secondary camera aimed at the curb and sidewalk, feeding into her existing system. She tested it by walking across the lawn in the afternoon and then stalking back to her workshop, ensuring that it covered the street without damaging anyone's privacy, just her own vantage. She then put a sign near the gate that read "Security cameras in use." It was plain, legal, and loud in its symbolism. She didn't want confrontation, but she intended to document. The final straw of the event that pushed the confrontation into territory she hadn't anticipated came on an overcast Friday afternoon when she was at the shop. She got a call from a neighbor who asked if she was aware that a food truck had set up in her side yard. She drove home immediately, wrench still in hand, and found a mobile taco cart nestled between the side fence and her garage wall, the vendor's awning extending slightly over the boundary line. The man behind it looked at her with mild surprise, but he wasn't hostile. He said, "Karen called me. Said she's renting your yard space today." Lena swallowed the knot forming in her throat and prevented her voice from trembling when she asked where Karen was. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable, and said he was just doing his job. When Lena confronted Karen later that evening, she found her unpacking boxes of taco supplies on her own porch, while a group of neighbors and their kids gathered in foldable chairs laughing and eating. Karen looked at Lena over her shoulder, clearly expecting a compliment, a nod, recognition. But Lena didn't speak. She watched. The vendor took it upon himself to explain that Karen had sent a message saying the yard was community space, and that the charge for stopping service would be higher than the setup fee. The confrontation that followed wasn't loud. It didn't erupt into shouting. It was mechanical, like machinery grinding gears until a belt snaps. Lena calmly told the vendor he was trespassing if he didn't leave no further comment. She turned to Karen and stated, without inflection, that she was prepared to take legal action, and that if the tacos were so important to the community, Karen was welcome to rent her own parking space, chairs, and permissions and pay for it herself. The vendor wheeled his cart away while Lena watched through the window. Karen stood on the porch for a moment, looking at her, eyes narrowing, and then left abruptly without waving. Lena documented the taco cart license plate, the vendor's permit, even called the local health department to confirm it had not authorized a semi-permanent installation in a private residential yard. The agent, embarrassed, said he would look into it immediately. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe the vendor would just move on. But the message was clear: Lena wouldn't tolerate physical invasions, particularly those that put her at legal or liability risk. Following that event, Karen shifted tactics again. The following Tuesday, Lena found her driveway blocked by a large moving truck. No one was unloading. A note was pinned to her windshield: temporary storage, moving day. It was unsigned. She called the towing company, no match. She called the phone number scrawled on the note, disconnected. She took a photo and sent it to Dana. A public records search showed no moving permits or registrations at that address. She called the city code enforcement office, who said they had received no complaints from her. But if she wanted, she could submit a form. She did. Each intrusion was escalating the cost of conflict, psychological stress, property wear, community judgments. But Lena remained resolute. She upgraded her recording equipment, added 2 doorbells, each with cameras and drop detection alerts. She had a friend catalog historical drone footage of the yard, just to have independent motion records. She hired a part-time security consultant, someone who had worked at auto offices, to suggest low-cost, deterrent landscaping, thorny shrubs, subtle bollards, walkway gravel that squeaks. She replaced her fence panels with reinforced cedar, barrels staked and bolted, and she had them treated so they wouldn't wear. She didn't do it for vengeance. She did it because she recognized that when you're targeted, defense isn't a weak reaction, it's your only declaration of dignity. One late evening, she caught a silhouette on her cameras mapping footpath routes around her property, stopping occasionally to shine a foam light at fence panels. A dozen headshots later, she had evidence logged to the second, backed up in 3 locations. She didn't post it anywhere. She didn't announce it. She just knew now that her opponent had shifted from community puppeteer to surveillant provocateur, mapping vulnerabilities like a reconnaissance team. And yet, the most surreal development happened when the police quietly dropped by her workshop, not responding to a call, but instead to talk. "Mom, we've had 3 reports: your security light, your cameras, your sign they're excessive," several people said, including some who'd been here since before you moved in. "Wanted to see if you were aware of their wording," the officer said, glancing at the cameras mounted near the windows. The officer wasn't blind. He was as pragmatic as Lena was, but his tone was suggesting too much, too soon, too conspicuous is, well, disruptive. You're making enemies. "It's my property," Lena replied. "It's not a public space." She handed him copies of her deed, the lawyer's approval memo, the cease and desist letter. The officer looked at them, nodded, and quietly said, "Understood. Try to keep it fair, but we're on your side." Lena didn't ask for his name. She thanked him, closed the office door, and paused for a moment. She felt fatigue, but not regret. Defense was expensive, both financially and emotionally, but without it, she was surrendering. And she knew exactly what surrender felt like. Days later, she found a voicemail on her work phone. It was Karen. No polite tone, just words clipped between inhales. "I know everything now," she said, voice harsh. "You're playing a game. Want to ruin me? Fine. But when I stop smiling at your house, I'll stop moving shit across your yard. Enjoy your bunker." The line went dead before any apology, any reclaiming of that community pretense. Lena listened to it twice, made a note. This was no longer about mistaken expectation or halfway tradition. It was personal. And she realized that her next move would have to be decisive, but measured one that couldn't be undone, one that would force the narrative to stop with her. At the end of that week, she reread her statement sheet, the one she'd begun writing months ago, and added an ending. Second escalation confirmed. Physical trespass, targeted intimidation, pattern harassment. Prepare final move. For now, she slept deeper than she had in weeks. Not because the tension was gone, but because she knew exactly what she was preparing for, and she wouldn't hesitate. Lena had always believed that the true culmination of a conflict wasn't a dramatic blow-up or an explosive confrontation in front of witnesses. It was a moment of surgical precision, an irreversible gesture made when the other side still thought they held the leash. By the time the next neighborhood event loomed, a vague Facebook-invited open cookout supposedly hosted by local community leaders, Lena was no longer watching for signs of intrusion. She was expecting it. Her yard had been quiet for days. Too quiet. Karen had gone dark on the usual platforms, and the fake complaints had stopped. Not a single leaflet, no new drive-bys, not even passive-aggressive flyers in the mailbox. It wasn't retreat. It was silence used as pressure, the kind that builds when your opponent is banking on you flinching first. But Lena wasn't about to flinch. When she arrived home one evening and found 3 long catering tables stacked just outside her gate, not on her property, but leaning against it, she didn't react immediately. She took photographs, checked her camera feeds, and logged the delivery time. There had been no note, no invoice, and no one on the street claimed them. But she knew they were intended for something. A trial balloon. A warning. An implication. This area will be used again, whether you like it or not. She had already made preparations weeks in advance. On the advice of Dana, she had retained not just her property lawyer, but also a private investigator, not for digging up dirt, but for collecting patterns. Surveillance, timestamps, behavioral predictions. Lena wasn't trying to catch someone breaking in. She was trying to create a full picture that would be unassailable in a courtroom if it came to that. The investigator found out what she suspected. Karen had used her name as an informal co-sponsor in several neighborhood emails and group messages, falsely attaching Lena to event permits that were drafted on generic letterheads without legal binding. Some neighbors truly believed Lena was involved. Karen had deliberately painted that image. But now, the situation shifted. Karen wasn't just invading. She was openly attempting to reclaim physical access, using the fiction of shared ownership to justify upcoming occupation. Lena knew the time had come not to argue, not to threaten, but to act. She waited until the morning of the event. By the time the first guests began to arrive, a row of orange rental cones blocked access to Lena's driveway. A flatbed tow truck was idling at the curb with hazard lights on. And in the middle of her now empty back patio stood not the industrial grill that had once been stolen for community use, but a freshly arrived construction trailer. Unmarked. Locked. Heavy duty. Behind it, 2 uniformed workers in matching polos stood with clipboards. Lena stood nearby in plain clothes, arms crossed. At 3:15 p.m., Karen's voice rang out from across the street. Her tone was loud, not confrontational at first, but strained. Lena didn't move. She waited for Karen to cross over, followed by a handful of bewildered neighbors, one of them holding a potluck dish. Karen tried again. "Lena, why is there a storage unit on your patio? We agreed this space was cleared today." "No," Lena said clearly, voice cutting through the group's low murmurs. "We did not agree." "You did." I didn't respond. Karen's jaw twitched. "You signed the interest form. You added your name. You've always been part of this. It's already been advertised." "That was forged," Lena replied, "and I've already filed reports about your misrepresentation." Karen took a step closer, lowering her voice but sharpening the edge. "People are here. You're making this a scene. Just roll it back and let us use the space for the community." "The community," Lena said, gesturing toward the yard, "doesn't have a deed to this property. I do, and today this yard is under documented commercial equipment storage for liability protection. Any unauthorized presence will be considered trespass." Karen stared at the trailer as if trying to will it out of existence. Her face contorted not in rage, not immediately, but in panic. She had miscalculated. She had assumed the silence meant surrender. She hadn't expected Lena to turn the space into something untouchable by community guilt. "You're being selfish," Karen hissed finally. "You're not from here. You don't understand what this neighborhood is built on." "I understand boundaries," Lena said, "and consequences." The tow truck moved slowly forward, blocking the driveway further. The two uniformed workers opened a side panel on the trailer and began conducting an inventory. Nothing illegal. Just enough procedure to freeze the space in a state of operational activity, exactly the kind of logistical noise Karen could not override. What followed was nothing short of collapse. Karen tried to regain control, barking orders at the small crowd, insisting the event would proceed on the front sidewalks and spillover areas. But neighbors hesitated. One man mumbled something about permits. Another woman quietly asked whether Lena had filed something official. Whispers spread quickly, confusion taking root. Karen's confidence unraveled as the questions grew. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply remained present, watching. At one point a neighbor approached and asked, "Is it true you were never part of the planning?" Lena only handed her a printed page, the cease and desist, stamped and signed. The neighbor nodded and walked away. By 4:45 p.m., the tables were being carried back across the street. The potluck dishes remained unopened. No music played. Karen stood alone at the edge of her lawn, jaw clenched, arms folded tight, glaring not at Lena, but at the truth she could no longer disguise. Lena walked up to her property line, stopped just shy of crossing, and said calmly, "This is done. You will not use my name, my yard, or my silence again. If I find another flyer, another email, another inch of your equipment on my land, you'll deal with attorneys, not warnings." Karen said nothing. Her face had frozen into a mask of disbelief, but her eyes darted calculating, spiraling, already retreating behind the walls of indignation and victimhood. As Lena turned to leave, one of the neighbors offered a nod, not in support, not in pity, but in understanding, a quiet acknowledgement. That was enough. That night Lena sat alone on her porch. The trailer was still parked, humming softly from its ventilation unit. Her cameras were armed. Her documentation was complete. There would be fallout, angry whispers, misinformed Facebook posts, maybe even new passive-aggressive tactics, but she no longer felt outnumbered. The rules had changed, permanently. And Karen had finally learned the cost of assuming silence meant permission. In the weeks that followed, the silence that fell over Lena's property was of a different nature. It was no longer the anticipatory quiet of someone waiting for the next boundary to be tested. It was earned, established, deliberate. The trailer remained for 10 days, parked like a monument to endurance, its flat gray surface catching the afternoon sun and deflecting curiosity like armor. There were no more flyers, no more pizza deliveries, no footsteps lingering outside her gate. Karen's presence receded visibly, her once daily struts past Lena's yard replaced by abrupt car departures and driveways sweeping at night. It was not a truce. It was a retreat, and Lena understood the weight of that kind of silence. She didn't celebrate it. She maintained it. When the trailer was finally removed, it was done without fanfare. The workers came early, retracted the stabilizers, loaded the box, and were gone before most neighbors were awake. Lena stepped out afterward, scanned the emptied space, and took a breath that didn't catch in her chest. She could hear birds again, wind through the trees. Her footfalls on the patio were the only thing that broke the calm. For the first time since she moved in, the space felt truly hers, uncontested, unclaimed by expectations she had never agreed to. She didn't rush to redecorate. She didn't throw a victory party. Instead, she cleaned the pavement slowly, methodically, sweeping and scrubbing the concrete as if it were an altar she was restoring, not just a backyard. There were no ceremonies, just small, necessary acts of reclamation. Word spread without Lena having to speak. The neighbors who had stood aside during the previous conflicts now offered subdued greetings, hesitant waves, sometimes short apologies masked as comments "you were right to stand firm," or "I guess I didn't realize how far she'd taken it." Lena never lingered in those conversations. She wasn't interested in absolution. But she accepted their change in tone the same way she accepted rainfall, indifferent, but expected after enough thunder. Karen, for her part, did not directly approach again. Her lawn became unusually tidy, her voice absent from neighborhood planning, her invitations no longer widely circulated. Some said she was regrouping. Others speculated she might move. Lena didn't care. She didn't seek revenge. The absence of harassment was its own answer. She didn't need Karen gone. She just needed to not be manipulated again, and now everyone knew that line existed. Lena returned her attention to the things that had mattered before the invasion. She rebuilt the grill station not as a shared centerpiece, but as a modular setup she could dismantle and lock down in under 5 minutes. She redesigned the garden perimeter with taller hedges and motion lights, built discreetly into solar lanterns. The new layout was still elegant, still functional, but it no longer begged for guests. It respected her limits. It protected them. She hosted no events, but she occasionally sat outside with a book or her laptop, or simply listened to the world return to its normal volume. One afternoon, a neighborhood teen who had once run across her yard on a scooter stopped at her gate and asked if she needed help carrying bags from her car. Lena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. The gesture cost her nothing, and she sensed it was less about the groceries than about unspoken apologies, one of the quietest shifts that spoke volumes about how people had begun to see her not as an outsider, but as someone they would no longer test. Lena knew the story would live on, twisted in recollection, exaggerated in some corners, softened in others. She would be remembered by some as the cold one, by others as the one who stood up, but she wasn't concerned with their versions. Her story was written in the records she had kept, in the footage she had saved, in the repaired fence that no one dared touch again. She didn't need them to understand. She just needed the space to no longer be confused for theirs. On a cool evening in late autumn, she finally installed a new sign at the edge of her yard. Not one of warning, not surveillance-related, just a simple black and steel plaque that read, "Respect lives here." She didn't hang it for Karen. She hung it for herself. And when the lights came on along her new stone path, illuminating the lines she had redrawn, Lena exhaled not in relief, but in completion. The battle hadn't changed her. It had clarified her. Boundaries were not fences, they were choices made visible. And now they were visible to everyone.